There are stories in Scripture that are not told to astonish, that hold no dazzling miracles, no seas split open, no thunder shaking the sky, yet they carry their power in quietness, in depth, like a long breath released after a weary day. And this story is one of them, a story for those who have felt themselves standing at the edge, who have believed grace was meant for someone else, who have grown used to expecting nothing more. Because when a person lives too long with lack and fear, even goodness becomes hard to believe. And so before you listen to this story, allow your heart to slow down, with no need to analyze, no need to understand, simply to listen as one listens to a whisper in the night. For this is not a story about a man whose legs were healed, but about a man who was invited to the king's table even though he never believed he was worthy. And in that quiet place, you may discover that somewhere within this story, there is also you. Mephibosheth lifted the spoon to his lips, the gentle scent of the food spreading through the air, and suddenly making him realize how long it had been since he last ate without caution, without calculating whether there would be anything left for tomorrow, without telling himself that merely surviving was enough. And the thought tightened his heart slightly, because there are things that, once a person has grown accustomed to lack, even when they are given, they do not dare to receive fully, as though opening their hands too wide would cause the grace itself to disappear at once. He chewed slowly, very slowly, not because the food was hard to swallow, but because memories were rising layer by layer, old memories covered in dust that he thought he had sealed away somewhere deep, where there was no light, where no one called his name, where Lodabar lay silent like a land that had never been promised anything good. In that place, time passed without clarity, day flowing into day without the need for marking, people living not to wait, but to avoid, avoiding questions, avoiding glances, even avoiding hope, because hope is the most painful thing when it never takes shape. And Mephibosheth learned this very early, from the moment he realized that the name he carried was no longer a blessing, but a danger, that the blood running through his veins once belonged to a throne, but now served only to make others wary. He remembered the afternoons in Lodabar, when the sun poured down without mercy, beating against rough walls and dusty roads, where he would often sit alone and listen to the sounds of life passing by without having anything to do with him. And in those moments, he believed he had been born only to stand at the edge, only to exist just enough, no more, no less, unseen and unmentioned. The quieting murmur of voices around the table drew him back to the present, where the light was still as gentle as before, where the table continued to conceal his crippled legs in a silent way, without display, without pity. And he suddenly realized that since the moment he had sat down, no one had seemed uneasy because of his presence. No gaze had lingered too long. No gesture had subtly suggested that he did not belong here. Ada, that thought made him glance up instinctively, very quickly, just long enough to see the king eating with his head bowed like everyone else, not looking at him with scrutiny, not looking at him as one spared from execution, but as one who was simply seated at the same table. And it was precisely that ordinariness that made his heart tremble, because throughout his life he had never been treated in such an ordinary way. He suddenly remembered the moment he first stood before the king, his body bowed low to the ground, words spilling from his mouth without thought, calling himself a dead dog, because that was the safest way to survive, the only way he knew to protect himself from power and from the memories of old purges. Yet what came back to him then was not a sentence, but a promise without conditions, without a demand for worthiness, given simply because a covenant had been made long before he was old enough to understand what it was. Thinking of this, Mephibosheth let out a quiet breath, a long exhale he had not realized he had been holding in his chest for so long, as though his entire life had been a series of breathless days, waiting for the moment his name would be called. And now, in the still light of the palace, in the midst of a meal that was nothing extraordinary, he began to sense something very strange, very fragile yet very real, that perhaps grace is not as loud as people imagine, that it comes not to overwhelm him, but to let him sit still, to let him eat slowly, and to let him believe that he would still be sitting here tomorrow. The meal continued without ceremony, the kind of quiet continuity that does not announce itself yet, slowly reshapes the heart, and Mephibosheth found himself listening to the soft rhythms around him, the gentle movement of servants, the muted clink of cups, the low cadence of voices that did not demand his attention, until those sounds blended into something almost like a lullaby, steady and unthreatening. And for the first time in his memory, he did not feel the need to stay alert, to measure every breath, to prepare for the moment when everything might be taken away. He noticed how the table remained between him and the world, how its solid presence formed a boundary that protected him from glances that might drift downward. And he wondered, not for the first time that evening, whether this was what mercy looked like when it did not announce itself with words, when it simply placed something firm and steady where fear used to live, allowing a man to remain as he was without explanation or apology. As the conversation flowed around him, touching on matters of the kingdom that felt distant and unreal, he realized that no one was asking him to speak, yet no one was excluding him either. And that strange balance unsettled him more than open rejection ever had, because rejection he understood, but belonging without conditions was a language his heart was still learning to hear. His thoughts drifted again, uninvited yet gentle, back to the days after his fall, when the pain in his legs had been sharp and immediate. But the deeper wound came later, when he understood that his body would never again move as it once had, and that understanding had quietly rearranged his expectations of the world, teaching him to shrink his hopes, to make himself small, to believe that survival was the highest form of success he could reasonably aim for. He remembered how people in Lodabar had been kind in practical ways, offering shelter and food, yet always with an unspoken distance, as though everyone sensed that his presence carried a history they did not want to invite too close. And over time he had learned to mirror that distance himself, keeping his voice low, his questions few, his desires carefully folded away where they could not disappoint him. Here at the king's table, those habits surfaced instinctively, urging him to eat quietly, to occupy as little space as possible, to leave no trace that might later be used as a reason to send him away. Yet the longer he sat there, the more those instincts began to loosen their grip, not because he had decided to be brave, but because nothing around him required fear to function. He dared another glance, slower this time, and saw the king pause to listen to someone across the table, his expression attentive yet relaxed, the face of a man who had fought battles and carried burdens, but who now, in this moment, was simply present. And Mephibosheth felt a subtle shift inside himself, the realization that the promise spoken earlier was not a single event preserved in memory, but something living, something being kept not through constant reminders, but through quiet consistency. The thoughts settled into him like warmth, spreading slowly, and he understood that this was how fear was undone, not by dramatic reassurances, but by repeated experiences that contradicted it, meal after meal, evening after evening, until the heart, worn down by gentleness, finally surrendered its defenses. He rested his hands on the edge of the table, feeling the smoothness of the wood beneath his fingers, grounding himself in the present, and allowed himself to imagine, just briefly, the possibility of tomorrow unfolding in the same way as today. Not because he had earned it, not because he had changed, but because the invitation did not depend on him at all. And that realization, quiet and profound, eased his breathing even further, as though the night itself were leaning in, urging him to rest. As the evening stretched on, Mephibosheth became aware of a subtle change within himself. Not a sudden transformation, but a gradual easing, like a knot that loosens without announcing the moment it gives way. And he found that his shoulders no longer held themselves so tightly, his breath no longer hovered near his throat, because the silence around the table was not the kind that waits for a mistake, but the kind that allows people to exist without explanation. He thought of how many years he had spent measuring every interaction, listening for hidden meanings, bracing himself for disappointment, and it struck him then that weariness had shaped his life more than pain ever had. The constant vigilance, the quiet readiness to retreat, the careful refusal to hope too much. And as he sat there now, surrounded by an ease he had not known before, he felt that weariness begin to lift, not all at once, but enough for him to notice its absence. The king rose briefly to speak with someone nearby, his chair moving back with an unhurried scrape. And though Mephibosheth felt the old instinct flare within him at the sound, the moment passed without consequence, the king returning to his place as naturally as he had left it. And Mephibosheth realized that the fear he had carried so long was slowly losing its cues, no longer able to find the signals it once relied on to justify itself. He remembered nights in Lodabar when sleep came lightly, easily broken by the smallest sound, when even rest felt provisional, something borrowed rather than owned. And he wondered, with a cautious curiosity, whether this night might be different, whether the calm that had settled over him could follow him beyond the table, beyond the hall, into the quiet hours when thoughts usually grew loud and unforgiving. The servants began to clear the dishes, their movements efficient and unremarkable. And as plates were lifted and cups removed, the table remained, steady and unchanged. And that constancy struck him as deeply symbolic, as though the space itself were saying that even when the meal ended, the invitation did not, that his place was not tied to the moment, but to a promise that extended beyond it. Mephibosheth allowed his gaze to rest on the table a moment longer, tracing the grain of the wood with his eyes, and he thought of how many times he had imagined himself at the edge of life, looking in but never participating, and how strange it felt now to be here, not as a curiosity, not as a tolerated exception, but as someone whose presence required no justification. A gentle fatigue settled over him, different from the exhaustion he knew so well, not the kind that comes from worry or strain, but the kind that arrives when the body senses it is safe enough to rest, and he welcomed it, letting it move through him without resistance, trusting for once that nothing would be demanded of him in return. As the evening drew to a close and people began to disperse, Mephibosheth remained seated for a moment longer, not because he was hesitant to leave, but because he wanted to hold on to the feeling, to let it anchor itself deep within him, so that when doubt returned, as he knew it would, he could remember this quiet truth, that grace had found him not in spite of his weakness, but without requiring its removal. When he finally rose to be guided away, his movements were slow but untroubled, and as he passed through the softly lit corridors of the palace, he felt no urge to look back, swore no fear that the door might close behind him forever, because something within him had already learned what his mind was still catching up to understand, that this was not a single evening set apart from the rest of his life, but the beginning of a rhythm, one that would return, steady and faithful, inviting him again and again to sit, to eat, and to rest. The corridors grew quieter as they moved farther from the hall, the sounds of voices and footsteps fading into a distant hum, and Mephibosheth noticed how the silence no longer pressed in on him the way it once had, no longer carried the weight of uncertainty, but instead felt wide and open, like a space that allowed thought to slow and settle rather than scatter in search of danger. He was shown to a place prepared for him, simple yet careful, and as he was helped to rest, he became aware of how naturally the evening was ending, without tension, without urgency, without the familiar sense that he must leave before someone changed their mind. And it occurred to him that this, too, was part of the mercy he had been given. Not only the invitation to the table, but the unspoken assurance that he did not need to rush, that he was not borrowing time from someone else's patience. Lying there in the dim light, his body finally still, he felt the weight of the day begin to settle into memory, and with it came the quiet realization that something within him had shifted, something subtle yet irreversible, because even as doubt stirred at the edges of his thoughts, it no longer held the center, no longer dictated the rhythm of his breathing or the shape of his expectations. He thought again of the king's words, of the promise spoken without hesitation, and he understood that the power of those words did not lie in their eloquence, but in the way they were being lived out, steadily and without spectacle, transforming fear not by confrontation, but by consistency until fear itself grew tired and loosened its hold. As sleep approached, gentle and unforced, Mephibosheth allowed himself to imagine the days ahead not as a series of threats to be navigated, but as a pattern to be entered, meals returning at their appointed times, faces becoming familiar, the table remaining where it was, waiting not for perfection, but simply for his presence. And this thought brought with it a peace so unfamiliar that he almost questioned it before deciding quietly to trust it. His breathing deepened, his thoughts drifting without urgency, and in that stillness he sensed, perhaps for the first time, that rest itself could be a form of faith, a way of believing that what had been given would not be taken away in the night, that the covenant which had reached across generations to find him would not falter now that it had finally done so. And so he slept, not as one bracing for loss, but as one who had been found, held in a silence that no longer spoke of abandonment, but of belonging, the kind that does not need to be proven each morning, because it has already been secured, quietly and completely, at a table where grace made room and never asked him to leave. Morning came without haste, the light filtering softly through the opening rather than forcing its way in, and Mephibosheth woke with the unfamiliar sense that he had slept deeply, not the shallow rest that leaves the body alert and the mind braced, but the kind that carries a person through the night without interruption. And as he lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet, he realized that his first thought was not fear, not calculation, not the question of what might be required of him today, but a simple awareness of being present, of having arrived at another morning without needing to justify it. He noticed how his breath moved easily now, how the tightness he had long accepted as normal was absent. And though he did not yet dare to name what this meant, he allowed himself to remain in that stillness, letting the sense of safety linger a little longer before the habits of the past could reclaim their place. And in that pause, he understood that peace did not always announce itself as joy, that sometimes it arrived as the quiet absence of dread. When he was helped to rise and prepared for the day, there was no rush in the movements around him, no hint that he was an inconvenience to be managed. And this ordinary attentiveness unsettled him again, not because it felt false, but because it required him to adjust the way he saw himself, to accept that he was no longer someone passing through, but someone expected, someone whose presence had already been accounted for. As he moved through the palace once more, guided along the same corridors he had passed through the night before, he felt a faint echo of yesterday's fear stir within him, the old reflex reminding him that patterns could break, that kindness could be withdrawn. Yet each step forward was met not with resistance, but with the same steady calm. And then gradually that echo faded, losing strength with every unchallenged moment. The table was there again, unchanged, its place unaltered. And when he was seated, the familiarity of it settled into him with a quiet reassurance, as though the promise made had not only survived the night, but had been waiting for him to return. And he understood then that faith for him would not be forged in moments of triumph, but in these repeated confirmations, in the simple act of showing up and finding that the space had been kept. He ate with the same measured slowness as before, yet now it was less guarded, less tentative, because his heart had begun to learn a new rhythm, one that did not demand proof at every turn. And as he listened to the low conversation around him, he found that he was no longer separating himself from it in his thoughts, no longer standing outside his own life as an observer, but allowing himself to be part of the flow, even if only quietly. There were still moments when doubt surfaced, when he wondered how long this could last, whether there would come a day when the table would no longer be set for him. But those thoughts no longer overwhelmed him because they were now countered by experience, by the steady accumulation of ordinary days that gently insisted on a different truth. And slowly, almost without his noticing, that truth began to take root. By the time the meal ended and the day opened before him, Mephibosheth felt a calm resolve forming within him, not a bold confidence, but a settled willingness to remain, to receive what was given without apology, and to trust that the grace which had brought him here would also sustain him, not because he was strong, but because the covenant that held him did not depend on his strength at all. As the days followed one another, each resembling the last in their quiet faithfulness, Mephibosheth began to notice how time itself seemed to change its character, no longer stretching endlessly ahead as something to be endured, nor collapsing inward as something to be feared, but unfolding at a gentle, human pace, marked not by anxiety, but by rhythm, by the simple certainty that morning would come, that the table would be set, and that his place would still be there when he arrived. He found that memory no longer rushed at him with the same force, no longer demanded to be answered or explained, because the present had become substantial enough to hold his attention, and when thoughts of Lo Jabah surfaced, they did so like distant echoes rather than open wounds, reminders of where he had been, not definitions of who he was. And this distinction, subtle as it was, allowed him to carry the past without being carried by it. There were moments often in the late afternoon when the light slanted low and familiar weariness returned to his limbs, that he would feel the old question rise within him, quiet but persistent, asking why this kindness had been extended to him, why his name had been spoken when so many others had been forgotten. And though he did not yet have an answer that satisfied the mind, his heart had begun to accept that some questions were not meant to be solved, only lived within, and that grace, by its nature, resists explanation. He watched how the king moved among his household, attentive without display, yet decisive without harshness, and gradually he understood that the promise which sheltered him was not a fragile thing, dependent on mood or circumstance, but an expression of character, something rooted deeper than impulse. And this realization brought with it a new kind of steadiness, the knowledge that what had welcomed him was not temporary favor, but enduring intent. At the table, conversations sometimes brushed close to matters of lineage and history, names spoken that carried weight and consequence. And in those moments, Mephibosheth felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the reminder of where he came from and what that once meant. Yet each time the feeling arose, it was met by the same unspoken truth made visible before him, that his identity here was not derived from what had fallen, but from what had been promised. And that promise had already been fulfilled in his presence. He noticed how his own posture changed, almost imperceptibly, how he no longer leaned inward as though bracing against disappearance, but allowed himself to sit with a quiet openness. And though his body remained the same, marked by the limits he carried since childhood, his sense of self expanded beyond them, no longer confined to what could be measured or seen, but anchored in the simple fact of being received. In the evenings, as the palace settled and the day released its hold, Mephibosheth often found himself reflecting not on what might be taken away, but on what had been given again and again without hesitation. And this repetition, more than any single moment of reassurance, taught him what trust could look like when it was allowed to grow slowly, shaped not by intensity, but by reliability. And so, without ever naming it as such, he began to live as one who belonged, not boldly, not loudly, but steadily, allowing grace to do its quiet work within him, day after day, meal after meal, until the fear that once governed his waking hours softened into memory, and rest, long withheld, found its place at last in the rhythm of his life. There came a day when Mephibosheth realized that he no longer counted the meals, no longer marked them as evidence to reassure himself that the promise was still intact, because the table had ceased to be a test and had become a given, something as steady as the walls around him. And this realization surprised him more than any act of kindness ever had, for it revealed how deeply the fear had once shaped his awareness, teaching him to measure safety instead of inhabiting it. He began to notice small things that he would once have missed, the way the light shifted across the floor as the hours passed, the familiar cadence of footsteps in the corridors, the subtle changes in tone when voices rose or softened. And these details no longer registered as warnings to be interpreted, but as signs of ordinary life continuing. And in their ordinariness, they offered him a sense of grounding he had never known. Sometimes when he was alone, he would think of Gionathan, of a bond formed long before his own memory began, and he wondered what it meant to be the living recipient of a promise made between others, to discover that his life had been shaped not only by loss and accident, but also by faithfulness that had outlasted death. And this thought carried with it a quiet humility, the understanding that grace often reaches us through paths we cannot trace. There were still moments when the old instincts returned, when a raised voice or an unexpected summons stirred something anxious within him, and in those moments he felt the familiar urge to retreat inward, to prepare himself for disappointment. Yet each time, the fear found no ground to stand on, because nothing followed it, no accusation, no withdrawal, no end to the welcome he had come to rely on. And slowly, through this repeated disconfirmation, fear began to loosen its claim. He recognized then that healing was not always a matter of removing wounds, but of teaching the heart to live without guarding them so fiercely, to allow space for trust where vigilance once ruled. And though this process was neither swift nor dramatic, it was thorough, reshaping him from the inside out through the steady pressure of unearned kindness. At the table, he sometimes found himself listening with genuine interest to the matters discussed, no longer because he felt obligated to appear attentive, but because he sensed that his presence was not merely tolerated, but assumed. And this shift, subtle as it was, marked a profound change. The movement from guest to household, from one who waited to be dismissed to one who remained without question. As evening returned and the light softened once more, Mephibosheth felt the familiar calm settle over him, and he welcomed it not as an exception, but as part of the rhythm that now held his days, a rhythm shaped by faithfulness rather than fear. And in that quiet, he understood that what had once seemed impossible had become real, that a man who had lived at the margins had been brought to the center, not through merit or effort, but through a promise kept. And though he knew that memory and doubt might visit him again, he no longer feared their arrival because he had learned where he belonged, not as a thought to be defended, but as a truth to be lived, resting in the assurance that the table would remain, and the invitation would stand, and grace would continue its quiet work, patient and unrelenting, within the life it had chosen to hold. With time, Mephibosheth began to understand that belonging reshapes a person in ways that effort never could. That when the heart is no longer consumed with proving its right to remain, it gains the freedom to notice others, to listen without fear, to exist without constantly bracing for loss. And this quiet freedom unfolded within him slowly, almost invisibly, until one day he realized he was no longer rehearsing explanations for his presence, no longer preparing himself to justify why he was still there. He found that gratitude, once sharp and anxious, had softened into something steadier, no longer clinging to each kindness as though it might be the last, but receiving it as part of a pattern that did not depend on his vigilance. And this shift allowed him to breathe more deeply into each moment, to experience it without the pressure of holding on to it. There were evenings when the past returned with unusual clarity, images rising unbidden, the fall, the sudden stillness afterward, the long years of learning how to live within limits he had not chosen. And while those memories still carried weight, they no longer defined the horizon of his life, because each memory now met a present reality that gently contradicted it, reminding him that the story had not ended where he once believed it had. He noticed how his understanding of the king had changed as well, how authority no longer appeared to him as something to be feared by default, but as something capable of sheltering as much as it governed. And this realization allowed him to see the covenant that protected him not as a fragile exception, but as an expression of a deeper faithfulness that extended beyond him, touching many lives in quiet, unseen ways. At times, as he watched others come and go, some welcome briefly, others remaining longer, he recognized in their faces the same guarded uncertainty he once carried. And though he did not speak of his own journey, his presence itself became a quiet testimony, a living assurance that mercy could endure, that invitation could remain open even when one's own story felt unfinished or broken. The table, unchanged and familiar, continued to serve as a silent witness to this unfolding grace, its surface marked by countless ordinary meals, each one reinforcing the truth that belonging is not forged in singular moments of intensity, but in the faithful repetition of welcome. And Mephibosheth understood that this repetition was not redundant, but formative, shaping the soul through its steady constancy. As night settled once more, and the palace grew still, he found himself no longer resisting the quiet, no longer filling it with anxious thought, but allowing it to carry him toward rest, trusting that morning would return in its appointed time, and that with it would come the same invitation, unchanged and unrevoked. In this way, without ceremony or declaration, Mephibosheth's life entered a new season, one marked not by the absence of weakness, but by the presence of grace, a grace that did not demand explanation, did not hurry transformation, but simply remained, steady and sufficient, inviting him again and again to sit, to receive, and to rest in a place he no longer feared would be taken away. Over time, Mephibosheth discovered that the truest measure of change was not found in how boldly he felt, but in how little he noticed himself at all, because the constant inward attention that once governed his thoughts had begun to ease, making room for a quieter awareness of the world beyond his own fragility. And this, more than anything, signaled that fear was no longer at the center of his days. He began to recognize that the table did more than feed him. It taught him patience, teaching him that there are gifts meant to be received slowly, without haste, without grasping, gifts that reveal their meaning only through time. And as he allowed himself to remain within that rhythm, he felt the deep fatigue of years lived in vigilance finally begin to dissolve. There were moments when he reflected on how easily his life might have remained unseen, how the accident of his childhood and the fall of his house could have sealed his story in silence. And this awareness did not lead him to bitterness, but to a sober humility, a recognition that grace is not predictable, that it reaches into places no one expects, guided not by worthiness, but by promise. He noticed, too, that his weakness, once a source of shame, no longer demanded concealment because it had lost its power to define the limits of his belonging, and though his body had not changed, the meaning attached to it had, allowing him to carry his limitations without the constant weight of self-judgment. As seasons shifted and the light changed its angle across the palace floors, Mephibosheth found that his sense of time had grown gentler, less urgent, as though he were no longer racing against an unseen clock. And in this gentleness, he discovered a new kind of attentiveness, an ability to notice the small faithfulnesses that often go unnamed, the steady keeping of promises, the quiet persistence of care. He came to understand that the covenant which sheltered him was not sustained by his memory of it, but by the faithfulness of the one who had spoken it. And this realization freed him from the burden of vigilance, allowing him to live without constantly looking back to confirm that grace was still there. In the evenings, when the palace grew still and the day released its hold, Mephibosheth no longer reviewed his actions with the anxious question of whether he had done enough to remain, but rested instead in the simple truth that he had been received as he was, and that this receiving did not waver with circumstance or mood. And so, quietly and without spectacle, his life settled into a peace that did not erase his past, but placed it within a larger story, one shaped not by loss or fear, but by faithfulness kept. And in that story, he found himself no longer standing at the edge, but seated firmly and finally at a table where grace had made room and where it continued, day after day, to remain. There were times when Mephibosheth would catch himself forgetting entirely where he was, not in the sense of confusion, but in the gentle way a person forgets pain when it is no longer speaking. And in those moments, he understood that healing often announces itself through absence rather than arrival, through the quiet fading of what once demanded constant attention, until one day it is noticed only in retrospect. He no longer rehearsed his story in his mind, no longer framed his life around the turning point of loss and survival, because the present had grown wide enough to hold him without reference to what had been broken. And this widening did not erase his past, but placed it in proper proportion, allowing it to exist without ruling him. At the table, he sometimes found himself smiling without intention, a small, unguarded expression that surprised him when he became aware of it. And he realized that joy, when it is not forced or defended, often appears quietly, slipping in through moments that are unremarkable in every outward sense, yet deeply transformative in their effect. He observed how others around the table carried their own unspoken histories, their own private fears and hopes, and he understood then that grace had not singled him out because he was uniquely broken, but because faithfulness moves according to its own logic, touching lives in ways that often remain hidden. And this awareness softened his understanding of himself, placing him among others rather than apart from them. The memory of Lo Jeba grew increasingly distant, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer felt like home. And this shift, subtle yet profound, marked the final loosening of a bond he had once believed unbreakable. The bond between identity and place, between who he was and where he had learned to survive. He began to sense that rest itself had become his inheritance, not as an escape from responsibility, but as a foundation from which life could be lived without constant strain. And in this rest, he found a strength that did not rely on effort, a steadiness that arose from being held rather than from holding on. As days turned into weeks and weeks into seasons, the promise that had once seemed too fragile to trust proved itself through endurance, through its refusal to diminish. And Mephibosheth understood that this endurance was the truest measure of grace, its ability to remain unchanged amid the slow turning of time. And so, without ever marking a moment of completion, he found himself living within a story that had moved beyond survival into belonging, beyond fear into rest. Seated at a table where grace did not announce its presence with grandeur, but revealed itself through constancy, inviting him again and again to remain. In that remaining, Mephibosheth discovered something he had never been taught to expect, that life could unfold without the constant need to justify his place within it, that belonging was not a reward for improvement, but a condition already granted. And this realization reshaped the way he listened to the world, no longer straining for threats hidden between words, no longer measuring silence as a sign of rejection, but receiving each moment as it came, steady and unadorned. He noticed how the rhythms of the palace, once overwhelming in their scale and unfamiliarity, began to settle into something almost ordinary. The sound of footsteps in the corridors, the low murmur of voices at dusk, the way evening light softened the stone walls. And in this ordinariness, he sensed a kindness more enduring than spectacle, the kind that does not demand attention, yet sustains everything it touches. Sometimes, late in the evening, he would remain seated after others had risen, not out of hesitation, but out of gratitude too full for movement. And he would reflect on how quickly fear teaches the body to be ready to flee, and how slowly peace teaches it that it may stay. And in that contrast, he recognized the patience of the grace that had met him where he was, without haste, without pressure, waiting for him to believe it at his own pace. The king's table did not change, yet Mephibosheth did, not through sudden insight or dramatic resolve, but through the steady accumulation of days in which nothing went wrong, days that quietly contradicted the expectations shaped by loss. And with each such day, his heart loosened its grip on old defenses, allowing trust to form not as a decision, but as a habit. He began to understand that the covenant which had brought him here was not a relic of the past, but a living word, one that continued to speak long after its original speakers were gone. And this continuity gave him a sense of being held within a story larger than his own wounds, a story that did not erase suffering, but refused to let it have the final word. There were moments when sorrow still surfaced, uninvited and familiar, but it no longer demanded obedience, and he learned to let it pass through him like a shadow crossing a room, present yet powerless to darken the whole. Because light once trusted changes the way darkness is perceived. And so Mephibosheth remained, not as a guest waiting to be dismissed, but as one whose place had been secured beyond his own understanding, seated again and again at a table that asked nothing of him except that he come, that he eat, that he stay. And in this simple invitation, repeated without end, he found the deepest miracle of all, not that his circumstances had changed, but that his heart had finally learned to rest. As he learned to rest within this new steadiness, Mephibosheth began to notice how deeply fear had once shaped even his smallest choices, how it had taught him to shrink his presence, to make himself lighter in every room, quieter in every conversation, as if taking up too much space might invite loss. And realizing this did not fill him with regret, but with compassion for the man he had been, a man who had done everything necessary to survive in a world that had offered him very little assurance. There were evenings when the weight of that realization pressed gently upon him, not as sorrow but as understanding, and he would sit in silence, aware that grace had not erased his instincts overnight, but had slowly surrounded them with patience, allowing old reflexes to soften without shame, without demand, until they loosened on their own. He saw now that being seated at the king's table had never been about proximity to power, but about proximity to faithfulness, about being drawn near not because he was strong enough to stand, but because the promise that brought him there was strong enough to carry him. And this distinction changed everything, freeing him from the burden of proving that he deserved what had already been given. In time, he noticed that he no longer measured his worth by comparison, no longer glanced around the table to see where he ranked among others, because belonging, once secure, no longer needs confirmation, and this quiet security allowed him to look outward rather than inward, to listen without guarding, to speak without rehearsing, to exist without bracing for disappointment. The palace itself seemed to respond to this shift, not because its walls had changed, but because his eyes had, in places once associated with distance and formality, began to feel like spaces of shelter, not grand in a way that intimidated, but expansive in a way that welcomed, as if the very air had learned to make room for him. He understood then that the greatest gift he had received was not protection from harm, but freedom from anticipation of harm, the release from living always a moment ahead of disaster. And in this release, his thoughts slowed, his breath deepened, and the world no longer felt like something he had to endure, but something he was allowed to inhabit. And so the days continued, not marked by remarkable events, but by their lack, by the steady reassurance of meals shared, of promises kept without reminder, of a place that remained his even when he was not looking. And in this unremarkable faithfulness, Mephibosheth found himself gently, almost without noticing, learning how to live not as one spared temporarily, but as one who truly belonged. With that belonging came a subtle courage, not the kind that announces itself through bold action or decisive speech, but the quieter courage of no longer disappearing within himself, of allowing his presence to remain visible without apology. And he sensed how unfamiliar this was, how often in the past he had survived by becoming small, by folding inward, by reducing his needs until they barely existed, believing that this was wisdom, believing that this was humility, when in truth it had been fear dressed in restraint. Now seated day after day at the same table, greeted without ceremony and without hesitation, he began to understand that true humility does not deny the gift, but receives it, and that receiving, when one has lived long without expecting anything, is its own form of bravery, requiring the heart to stay open even when it expects disappointment. There were moments when he would catch himself listening for the unspoken until, the condition that must surely follow such kindness, and each time it did not come, Something within him loosened a little more, as if layers of caution long hardened by necessity were slowly dissolving under the steady warmth of consistency. He thought often of the covenant that had made all of this possible, a promise spoken long before his injury, before exile, before fear had shaped his understanding of the world. And he realized that grace had been moving toward him even when his own life seemed to be moving away from hope, tracing a path he could not see, patient enough to wait until he was ready to be found. This realization reframed his memories, not erasing the pain of what had been lost, but placing it within a larger arc, one in which loss did not negate promise and waiting did not cancel faithfulness. And in this larger story, his years of obscurity were no longer meaningless, but part of a journey whose destination had been secured long before he arrived. At times, as the evening light settled softly over the table and voices lowered into gentler tones, he felt a quiet gratitude rise within him, not urgent, not overflowing, but steady and deep, a gratitude that did not ask for more, because it had finally learned that what it had been given was enough. And in that sufficiency, Mephibosheth rested, no longer scanning the horizon for change, no longer bracing for reversal, but allowing the present moment to be what it was, trusting that tomorrow, when it came, would find him in the same place, welcomed by the same faithfulness. I'm invited once again to sit, to eat, and simply to remain. As this trust settled deeper, Mephibosheth became aware of how time itself had changed its texture, no longer rushing past him like something to survive, no longer dragging with the weight of uncertainty, but unfolding at a human pace, measured not by anxiety, but by presence, by the simple assurance that each day would meet him with what it had promised, neither more nor less. He noticed how his thoughts, once scattered and vigilant, began to gather themselves naturally, forming a quiet attentiveness to the world around him, to the tone of voices, to the warmth of lamplight against stone, to the shared pauses between words at the table. And he understood that peace does not silence the world, but allows one to hear it without fear. There were moments when he reflected on how long he had believed that safety was fragile, something that must be protected through constant awareness, and now experiencing a safety that required no guarding, he realized how much energy fear had once demanded, how much of his life had been spent simply holding himself together, and how gentle it felt to finally lay that burden down. The table remained the same, its surface worn smooth by countless meals and countless stories, yet to him it had become a sign, not of abundance alone, but of continuity, of a promise that returned each day in tangible form, reminding him that faithfulness is proven not through grand declarations, but through repetition, through showing up again and again without withdrawal. He understood now that being remembered was itself an act of grace, that his name had been spoken not as a reminder of a fallen house, but as an affirmation of a bond that outlived both triumph and failure, and this knowing allowed him to hold his history without being held by it, to acknowledge where he came from without letting it define where he stood. Sometimes as conversation drifted around him, he would sit quietly, not out of retreat, but out of contentment, aware that he did not need to be central to be secure, and this awareness freed him from the pressure to prove his place, allowing him to simply be, present without performance. And in this stillness, so unlike the stillness of hiding he had once known, Mephibosheth sensed that his life had entered a season not of striving, but of dwelling, where meaning was found not in movement or achievement, but in the steady grace of remaining, day after day, in a place where he was neither questioned nor forgotten, but continually, faithfully welcomed. In this dwelling, he began to perceive how deeply his understanding of God had shifted, no longer imagined as a distant judge tallying worthiness, nor as a force that intervened only in moments of spectacle, but as a faithfulness that stayed, that endured quietly through ordinary days, revealing itself most clearly not in rescue from danger, but in the absence of abandonment. He reflected on how often he had prayed in earlier years, not for restoration, but for invisibility, asking only to be overlooked, to survive unnoticed, believing that silence was mercy, and now receiving a kindness that neither hid him nor exposed him. He realized how small his expectations had once been, shaped not by truth, but by the limits of his fear. The palace, with all its movement and order, became to him a place of instruction, teaching him without words that stability is not rigidity, that faithfulness does not resist change but outlasts it, and that a promise kept does not need constant explanation, because its consistency speaks more convincingly than any reassurance ever could. There were days when memories returned with unexpected clarity, not to accuse him or to pull him backward, but to be reinterpreted in light of where he now sat. And he understood that healing often works this way, not by erasing what was, but by revisiting it from a place of safety, allowing old wounds to be seen without reopening. He noticed that he no longer flinched at sudden sounds, no longer measured each interaction for signs of threat, and this quiet transformation felt almost unreal, as if his body itself were learning a truth his mind had not yet fully articulated, that he was no longer living on borrowed time, no longer a guest whose presence depended on restraint. At the table, as plates were cleared and conversation softened into the easy cadence of familiarity, Mephibosheth sensed a gratitude that did not rush toward expression, that did not demand language, but settled within him as a steady awareness, a recognition that what he had been given was not temporary relief, but a place anchored in promise. And so he remained, allowing the days to come and go without fear of their ending, trusting that the same grace that had invited him in would continue to hold him there. Not because he had learned how to stay, but because faithfulness, once extended, does not withdraw. And in this certainty, quiet and enduring, and he found himself finally at rest. In that rest, Mephibosheth began to sense that his life was no longer defined by what might be taken away, but by what had already been secured, and this awareness reshaped the way he imagined the future, not as a fragile extension of the present, but as a continuation held within the same promise that had carried him this far. He thought of how often he had once measured tomorrow by the limits of today, believing that scarcity was the natural order of things, that loss was only waiting for its moment, and now living within a kindness that did not recede, he learned that hope does not rush ahead, but grows slowly where trust is allowed to remain. There were nights when he would leave the table later than usual, moving through the quiet corridors with an ease that would have been impossible before. And he noticed how silence no longer felt like danger, but like shelter, a space where nothing was demanded of him, where his thoughts could settle without needing to stay alert. He understood then that peace had entered his life not as a single moment of realization, but as a gradual unlearning, the steady undoing of habits formed under fear, and that this unlearning required time, repetition, and patience, all of which grace had provided without impatience or reproach. The memory of calling himself a dead dog before the king no longer burned with shame, but softened into understanding, and he could see that the words had been spoken by a man who did not yet know that mercy could exist without conditions, and this realization allowed him to extend toward his former self the same gentleness that had been extended toward him. As seasons continued to turn, the table remained a constant, its presence quietly affirming that what had been promised was not dependent on mood, circumstance, or performance. And Mephibosheth began to recognize that constancy itself is a form of love, one that does not draw attention to itself, yet reshapes everything around it. And within that constancy, his heart settled more fully, no longer bracing for disruption, no longer waiting for permission to exhale, but living as one who had finally learned that grace does not merely visit, it abides. And in its abiding, it teaches the weary soul that it is safe to stay. As this abiding became familiar, Mephibosheth sensed that even his prayers had changed, no longer shaped by urgency or negotiation, no longer framed as careful requests offered from a distance, but unfolding instead as quiet acknowledgments, moments of awareness in which gratitude rose without needing to be spoken, because the answer had already taken form in the life he was now living. He began to see that the table was not only a place of provision, but a place of remembering, where each meal quietly testified to a promise older than his wounds. And this remembering did not trap him in the past, but anchored him, giving his days a steadiness that did not depend on how he felt upon waking or what uncertainties the world beyond the palace walls might still hold. There were times when he watched the servants move about their tasks with practiced calm, and he recognized in their unremarkable faithfulness a reflection of the grace that had sustained him, a grace that did not demand attention, that did not announce itself loudly, yet never failed to appear where it was needed, day after day, without interruption. He realized then that much of his former life had been spent preparing for endings, assuming that every good thing carried within it the certainty of departure, and now living within a goodness that showed no sign of leaving. He found that his heart was learning a new posture, one that did not lean forward in anticipation of loss, but rested back into the present moment as something trustworthy. Even his understanding of weakness shifted, no longer seen as a liability that disqualified him from belonging, but as the very place where faithfulness had chosen to meet him, covering what was exposed without attempting to correct it, honoring his life as it was rather than as it might have been under different circumstances. As the lamps dimmed and voices faded into the gentle quiet of evening, Mephibosheth remained seated for a moment longer, aware that there was nothing he needed to secure before leaving, nothing he needed to say to ensure his return, because the invitation did not depend on his vigilance, but on a promise that did not grow tired. And in rising from the table with this certainty settled deep within him, he carried away not fear or disbelief, but a calm assurance that tomorrow would find him once again within the same grace, called by name, welcomed without hesitation, and allowed simply and fully to remain. As he carried that assurance with him, Mephibosheth began to understand that the truest transformation had taken place quietly, beyond what could be measured or displayed, in the way his heart no longer tightened at kindness, in the way his mind no longer searched for the hidden cost behind generosity. And this change, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, marked the end of a long inner exile he had never known how to name. He saw now that exile is not always a matter of distance or geography, but often a condition of expectation, a life lived while bracing for rejection, and that return does not always require a journey back, but sometimes only the courage to stay when grace refuses to withdraw, and in staying, to allow oneself to be seen without defense. There were moments when he considered how easily his story might have ended differently, how thin the line had been between being remembered and being lost to silence. And this awareness did not fill him with bitterness, but with reverence, a quiet respect for the faithfulness that had reached him not at his strongest point, but at his most resigned. He noticed that his laughter, once rare and cautious, now surfaced without calculation, brief and unguarded, and he understood that joy, when it finally feels safe, does not ask permission, but emerges naturally, like breath released after a long confinement, carrying with it no explanation, only relief. The table, unchanged in form, had become a threshold between who he had been and who he was becoming, and each time he crossed it, each time he took his place without hesitation, he affirmed a truth that no longer required rehearsal, that his presence was not tolerated, not temporary, but woven into the ongoing life of the house. He sensed that even if circumstances beyond the palace walls remained uncertain, even if the world continued to shift and kingdoms rose and fell, the promise that held him was not subject to those movements, because it rested not on stability of power, but on the character of faithfulness itself, which does not adapt to circumstance, but remains. And so Mephibosheth lived within that remaining, his days no longer shaped by survival, but by trust, no longer narrowed by fear, but widened by grace, seated again and again at a table that asked nothing of him except that he be present, and in this presence, quiet and unremarkable yet profound, he found the enduring peace of one who is no longer waiting to be sent away. With that peace came a gentler awareness of others. As though once his own fear had loosened its grip, his attention was finally free to move outward, and he began to notice the subtle burdens carried by those around him, the quiet weariness behind composed faces, the careful manners that sometimes hid uncertainty. And this noticing did not weigh him down, but deepened his gratitude for the grace that had taught him how to stay. He understood then that grace, when truly received, does not end with the one who receives it, but reshapes the way that person inhabits the world, softening judgment, slowing impatience, making room where there once had been none. And he sensed that without ever intending it, his own presence at the table had become a quiet testimony, not of triumph over hardship, but of faithfulness that does not withdraw from weakness. There were moments when he reflected on how invisible he had once believed himself to be, how convinced he had been that his life could pass unnoticed without consequence. And now, seated within a household that remembered him daily, he realized that being seen does not always mean being scrutinized, that sometimes it simply means being held in mind, counted, expected, and welcomed back without question. The passage of time no longer frightened him, because time, once an enemy that threatened to expose his fragility, had become a witness to constancy. Each returning meal, each familiar voice reinforcing the truth that what endures does not need to hurry, and that faithfulness reveals itself most clearly, not in beginnings, but in continuance.